Thanks very much, everyone. I'd like to first acknowledge the Bindal and Woolgoorukaba people and thank them for welcoming us and hosting us today on their country. I'd also just like to mention that although I'm here presenting in front of you today, this is the work of a research team of 4. So my colleagues, John, Shakaya and Sammy are in the room as well. So I just wanted to give them a shout out because this is really a collective effort. So I wanted to talk to you today about a project we've been doing for about the last year or so, which is working with 6 different communities throughout the reef. So you can see them there on the right-hand side, all the way from Bundaberg up to Cooktown. And the aim of this project is really to understand, well, what matters to different communities throughout the reef, and why do those things matter in terms of supporting their well-being. So well-being is the nexus for this project, and that's for a few reasons. Really, we're using wellbeing as a way of kind of understanding, what allows communities to thrive in place and what's going to allow and support those communities to thrive into the future, and including the long-term future as the environment changes, because we know that the climate is changing, the environment is changing, that's already impacting people's wellbeing and will accelerate. So the idea was to understand I guess, where communities are at in terms of what they value. So to Tracy and Molly's point, understanding and speaking to the values that people hold within communities and not just the values that we might bring as researchers or scientists, and then being able to reflect that in climate adaptation. So we did a pilot study involving those 6 communities. We had 42 participants. And the methodology was really small group deliberation. So I'll show you what that looks like in practice. But essentially the aim was to draw on, if you've kind of been part of or known about deliberation before, it often draws on scientific information and knowledge. This was trying to sort of flip that a little bit and say we're going to draw on the values and knowledge of and feed in that information from the participants themselves. So it wasn't so much about engaging with scientific information as understanding what are those values, what are those attachments to place, what do people love about where they live, and then, translating that towards the end of the process into visions and preferences for the future. So this is the research process. We held a number of meetings over the course of about 6 months, starting in September last year. And you can kind of see that we started out just talking about place attachment. What do you love about where you live? What are your favourite places? What do you think about your region? What are the kinds of values that you associate with the region? And then the reef as well. So we looked at those 3 different scales. Then we went and talked a little bit more about change over time. So since you've lived in the region, and most people had been there for maybe sort of up to 30 years, so what changes have you seen? So in Cairns, for example, the growing of tobacco, how have land uses changed, but also kind of people's perceptions of the environment and the place meanings that are associated with their region. We also talked about emotions at those 3 different scales. What are people feeling about their favourite place versus their local region versus the reef? And then towards the end of the process, we talked about climate change. So we were very conscious of not bringing climate change in as a term too early in the process, to Liz's point about that kind of polarisation within, I guess, perceptions of climate change. So we really wanted to spend a lot of time doing group building and increasing deliberation before we got to that point. This is sort of what it looks like. I don't know if I can actually start this from here. There's a little video that kind of shows you my Miro board. So I don't know if you're familiar with Miro board as a tool, but it's pretty cool. So we actually did some of these meetings in person and some of them online, partly because we want to minimise the amount that we're travelling and allow people just for accessibility. But we use this Miro board in all of the meetings, and it's now kind of a public record for anyone who is involved in our project. So anyone can access it. We had meetings where some people would add things, or we would add things to the Miro board for them. So it's like a live sort of checking, really, of the information that people provided. And now we've got a repository. Oops. So this is kind of then what some of that information looks like. This is from the meetings in Mackay. And you can see there on the top left-hand side, there's just an exercise there where community members were discussing what they wanted, what they valued about their local region, their favourite place in the region and the reef, and then did a bit of a clustering exercise about the values. And then you can see these summaries that Shakaya has developed. So at the end of every meeting, we did a summary, reported back, and then had a bit of a discussion about what we had interpreted from the meeting and what people thought of what we were taking from it as well. So really, I guess then what comes out of this? And I think I've just decided today just to focus on a couple of the headline findings. So it's a bit of a grab bag, but I thought I'd give a bit of a survey. And if anyone's interested in particular aspects of the research, please let me know, because it was quite broad ranging in terms of the topics that we were talking about in each meeting, and also the sort of, I guess, conceptual frameworks that we brought to it. But essentially, one of the things that we found is, and I mean, it's kind of self-evident in some ways, but aligning adaptation with local character, needs and values is really important. And those are very distinct in the different regions. So what we came up with are these regional fingerprints for each of the regions that participated in the research, that kind of are a snapshot of what is important in each region at the moment. So we know what the building blocks of wellbeing are broadly, but the way that that is expressed in a particular region is very variable, actually, throughout the reef. So it's important to kind of understand how people weight those different priorities. You can see on the right-hand side just a little bit of a kind of a snapshot of how people talked about their region. The other thing I wanted to note is that place character is so important, and in enduring place meanings, you know, they persist even though things change. So for example, in Cairns, tobacco farming doesn't exist anymore, but people are still sometimes talking about that. Place meanings can endure even though the environment is changing. It's particularly important in the reef at the moment. So even though we're seeing a lot of environmental change, place meanings are still fairly static. And that has an impact on how people feel about the need for adaptation and the urgency of adaptation. I also wanted to mention, just spend a little bit of time talking about perspectives on climate change. So I guess similar to what Liz was saying earlier about a proportion of the community that is maybe sort of leaning towards climate change denial or being resistant to the idea that the climate is changing. We saw a real range of views about climate change, from people who were quite sceptical to people who were quite concerned. There's a really common perception that weather changes are very cyclical and that we're not really out of the norm, that things have happened before. People, thank you, drawing on lived experience to say, well, we've seen flooding, we've seen cyclones, and we're actually pretty good at dealing with them. So there's a really strong sense of local identity, North Queensland, about, you know, coping with extreme weather, and also a very persistent belief that technology is going to help us get out of this, or that we can still, sure, it's getting too hot. People were really concerned about heat. But it's, you know, we can still put the aircon on. And that's a bit of a shame, because if we went back to the 70s, you know, we were living more sustainable lives, but at least, you know, we've got technology now to help us through. So you can see some of the kind of spread of views on the right-hand side there. One thing I did want to mention is that similar to place meanings being quite resilient, communities are still overall feeling pretty positive about the reef, and that's actually in contrast to what a lot of the stakeholders closer to the reef are saying. So we've got, I might just draw your attention to the wheel on the right-hand side, because we don't have too much time. But you've probably seen these kinds of wheels before. So we used essentially an existing emotions wheel to kind of understand and, you know, validate it with the communities and say, well, which one of these feelings resonates with you? And got people to select the top three emotions that they were feeling in relation to each of those scales. So local, region, reef, and favourite place. And what we found is that emotions related to place are really, really critical. So most people are selecting feelings related to place and action, which is, I think, super interesting, because they haven't been captured in broader sort of emotion wheels. So place is the connector. That's our group in Townsville. I don't have time to talk about focus group methods, but I'm a real methods nerd, and I know that's a lot of people in this room who are very similar. So I'd love to have a chat about the pros and cons of focus group methods. We tried a new way of recruiting through a market research company this time, and that's got some pros and cons too. And so love to chat about it. But really just, I guess in ending, we know that climate change is already affecting community wellbeing, but each community has a very distinct set of priorities and challenges. And so understanding then what matters to communities, but also why those things matter is really critical, because even if what the current state changes, understanding why those things are important helps us to develop kind of ongoing or enduring policy outcomes. Thanks very much.